Lovely, thank you, Ben, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So we've got a really exciting panel. We're going to talk about regulatory convergence and kind of what we think that means, and as Ben said, what we think are some of the policy areas where we think this convergence might occur in the future. So a very exciting topic, and hopefully not too hard at the end of a very long day of people absorbing fascinating information. So as a very quick introduction from myself, and then I'll introduce the panel who are going to be having a stimulating conversation about reg convergence. I'm a partner in Deloitte. I've been working in and around the reg and compliance space for a very long time now, currently focused on corporate compliance, but also internet regulation and what organisations, how they're responding basically to the kind of tsunami of regulations that are emerging from around the world in relation to this topic. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel. And so I'll start with Katherine, if that's okay. We'll do a quick introduction.
Sure, thank you. And thank you so much for having me on the panel today. This is going to be really informative, I hope, for everyone. I am the Acting Director of the Office of Privacy and Civil Liberties at the U.S. Department of Justice. A bit about what that means. We play a central policy-making role in the Department of Justice's evaluation and development of legislation, regulatory, and policy proposals. We also help ensure compliance of the Department of Justice and its 42 components, many involving law enforcement and national security, with the laws that apply in the U.S. federal government. Something that's a bit new is that we will be providing administrative support to the new Data Protection Review Court that is being was established actually last Friday through an executive order signed by the president and also a Department of Justice regulation. The DPRC is going to be the second layer of a two-layer redress mechanism. Certainly don't want to go off on a tangent on the new data protection framework too much, but wanted to mention that that is a role that we are going to be playing. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Katherine. Moving on to Rene.
Yes, hello, Lauren. Hello to everybody here. My name is Rene Repasi. I'm greeting you here from Brussels in the office building of the European Parliament. I'm a member of the European Parliament, rather young in the business, admittedly, because I'm only here since February 2022, here acting in the field of internal market and consumer protection regulation, financial market regulation, and competition law, and legal affairs. And in my previous life, I was a professor of law at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and dealing therefore with a lot of issues on market regulation in my previous life from an academic perspective, and now from a practical perspective. And my first experiences in the field was the regulation of digital markets, as I was shadow rapporteur for the Digital Markets Act.
Excellent, thank you, Rene. And last but by name is least, Monika.
Thank you, Lauren. My name is Monika Adamczyk. I am currently located in Greece, in Athens, where I work for ENISA. ENISA is the European Union Cybersecurity Agency, and our main mandate is achieving a high common level of cybersecurity across Europe. Within this agency, I work for the Policy Development Implementation Unit, where I currently support the European Commission on the preparation of the AI Act. Before working for ENISA, I spent a few years back in my native Poland when I worked, for example, for a Data Protection Authority, for the Ministry of Digital Affairs, dealing with different aspects of cybersecurity and data protection. But I also work for UN in Vienna for International Atomic Energy Agency. And before that, I actually spent about half of my life working for the US government as a federal contractor, supporting different IT projects as a software engineer, IT manager. And I'm looking forward very much to our conversation during today's panel. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Monika. So we're going to kick off with a kind of a broader question, if you like, with regard to the overall topic that we're going to talk about today. And that's starting with, why do you think there is a need, or why do you think we're seeing regulatory convergence occur? What do you think are kind of the drivers behind that? And maybe we can start with Katherine.
Okay, sure. The global economy is really what's got to drive some sort of convergence, or at least interoperability between different legal regimes. Now we have companies that are operating in hundreds of jurisdictions all at once with servers and data. flowing around without any regard to borders or jurisdiction. So we really do have to have some sort of convergence or interoperability to support companies, support government agencies in providing the services they need to provide and providing public safety. So the convergence interoperability is really critical right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from the other panelists at all on that topic?
If I can add, what Katherine has said about global economy and the fact that everybody right now operates pretty much in a space that does not have borders. This is also very important from the perspective of the implementation, because any regulation, any law that is supposed to be implemented needs to basically take into account the situation that it actually has to be implemented in such a way that businesses and government organizations and public authorities and everyone else, including individuals, need to be able to find themselves in the global environment and basically have a good understanding how to implement and how to comply with those regulations.
Agreed. And any thoughts from you at all, Rene?
Yeah, certainly. I think, of course, convergence, I mean, when we technically normally speak of regulatory convergence, we think about convergence across jurisdictions. But of course, the term of convergence encompasses more than that. It's also convergence across policy areas. And that is somewhat adding, of course, to the complexity that we want to achieve by convergence across jurisdictions. Since you have, when you just look, for example, at the regulation of digital markets, you have the competition law angle, where also the European Commission is following a certain way of how it applies competition law within the internal market, although economic operators are established outside of it. You have then data protection rules, which are different, which has then national regulators that are working and are applying different principles, although a certain violation might be the same. Because privacy and competition law are actually interacting and are actually needing each other in order to reinforce each other. Now we are getting certain digital product regulation in there, such as the AI Act. So we do have basically a need for convergence across policy fields now within the jurisdiction of the European Union in order to actually enable regulatory convergence across jurisdictions that also look at different regulatory patterns. Once looking, be it inside the US, be it inside the European Union.
Okay, fascinating. And one of the things we're going to talk about next, I think, is around what do you see as the current or the most important areas of potential or existing convergence. So you touched there briefly on the Digital Markets Act around markets and competition and data privacy, but what other areas do you think that we are, if we look forward into the future, where do you think we're going to see increased convergence, perhaps in terms of policy areas?
Well, I don't mind jumping in for a second. Yeah. So in my view, international data transfers are really the biggest area where we need to find some sort of interoperability and convergence. And I do believe that there are, in multiple different forms right now, a lot of efforts to find convergence. There's so much commonality between the democratic rule of law nations and how we are handling things like cybersecurity and data protection and privacy, and even competition law, that with these commonalities, we need to build from the commonalities in a way that that sets a high standard, but then also allows countries to be able to implement the standards that are being set so that they're not so rigid and detailed that they're not adaptable. They need to be adaptable. High standards, but also adaptable and implementable in countries that have different legal, historical, and cultural contexts.
Interesting. Thank you, Katherine. Anything from you on those policy areas, future policy areas, Rene?
I mean, ultimately it is where is the biggest need for convergence? We have the convergence where we do have, or we need convergence where we do have meaningful cross-border economic interactions. And of course, especially in those areas that are now still growing. Digital, I think, is currently one of the most important areas where convergence is needed. And I mean, the first reaction after we have adopted the DMA was to reach out to our US partners in order to get an arrangement how we do DMA enforcement in cooperation. Because I mean, the scope of application of the DMA is basically US-based companies. In that sense, we can have nice regulatory standards, but we need to cooperate with our US counterparts in order to make the whole legal framework work. And if you look at this particular logic, then we do have also other fields in which there is meaningful cross-border trade that requires actually sort of level playing field in terms of regulatory convergence. And the thing I'm still thinking of is, of course, financial market regulation, in which standards do differ, in which meaningful regulatory convergence and cooperation is, I do believe, necessary.
And from yourself, Monika, you touched on briefly in your introduction there about AI regulation. In your kind of, with your background and your experience, where do you think that kind of the future sort of important areas of potential convergence might occur?
Well, I'm hoping that, convergence in technical policies, and for example, policies for technologies such as AI would actually be uniform across the world, because once again, the data transfer it's happening whether we want or not, across multiple continents, across multiple states, and protection of this information, and I'm talking about protection both of personal and non-personal data, is essential. And the fact that we are using in our daily basis, or in big businesses, we're using systems and services that we cannot predict how they will impact us, whether they will provide us with positive or negative consequences. And I think in this case, coming to an agreement between different legal areas in the world to agree how to, at one hand, how to enable the development and use of these technologies, but at the same time, how to ensure that they are done in such way that we can talk about, trustworthy solutions, about non-bias, that we will have basically a common approach to these technologies. And we also have a common approach to protecting all the information, all the data, which is commodity in our world. And of course, at the same time, protection of our privacy in such way that we all benefit from this.
And I was going to say that leads me on, and I'll come back to kind of the order of questioning in a second. But just to expand on that a bit, I think everybody would have seen in the press there's an ongoing rumbling, if you like, between that dilemma between privacy and security, and what's the balance that needs to be struck. I mean, what's your thoughts with regard to that? I'm starting with you, Monika, but obviously open to anyone's views.
Maybe I will start this time, as a techie. So, I mean, yeah, we always hear that, privacy and security should go hand in hand, but at the same time, we realize that it's not uncommon to find that privacy requirements work against security, and this happens mostly because sometimes the privacy requirements don't allow all the security measures which may be too invasive to individuals. At the same time, security sometimes encroaches on privacy for exactly the same reason. And in my opinion, the best approach to this is basically it's what's called a risk-based approach. So basically, assessing the entire situation, assessing the objective of both perspective, and trying to find, based on the current context, on the situation, which of the, let's say, sides of this balance needs to, I don't want to use the word bend, although this is what comes to my mind, but at least how to find the most acceptable and most appropriate solution that provides the adequate level of security while not impacting significantly privacy and protection of our personal information. Now, it's not an easy task. It's a very difficult challenge, but unless we try this, and we try it continuously, we will always be facing the challenges of either protection losing or security losing. or sometimes both of them might have an impact on the functionality of certain service or system. And then, of course, it's kind of a triangle where all the three items have to be in a perfect balance.
Fascinating. Any thoughts from you, Katherine?
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said, Monika. I'm sorry. Thank you. I completely agree with the points that you raised. We have to be able to provide data protection, privacy, and also public safety. So how do those goals come together? I do think that there are a number of forums in which the commonalities are being identified. So we've got 22 countries signed this past May the Council of Europe Cybercrime Convention, second additional protocol, which I think does a really good job of explaining how countries can get the evidence that they need in law enforcement matters. And it was really successful in those negotiations, in part because you had data protection officials, but you also had law enforcement officials in the room really hammering out what can be done to protect privacy, but then also protect public safety. So that's just one example. The OECD right now is working on a trusted government access initiative, and I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to develop principles through that forum that will also achieve this balance and with the key democratic rule of law nations in the room with the subject matter experts and then also the data privacy experts to come up with those principles. The new replacement for the Privacy Shield, the data privacy framework between the EU and the US, sets forth US commitments that we firmly believe are going to meet the requirements and are going to be deemed adequate in the European Union. So I believe that there are a lot of initiatives, and I think there's a lot of promise right now in trying to find that convergence and interoperability between the different frameworks, in trying to find that balance with national security and also public safety.
What do you think we talked about some of the forums available, I guess, for making or allowing or enabling this convergence or this harmonisation or this working together to take place. What do you think are the best ways in which this can happen? Because it is a challenge, I guess, to get regulators from around the world to kind of to coalesce around this convergence point. But what do you think are some of the ways in which it can work well?
I think that the way that the Council of Europe operates in having the different countries and with the second additional protocol, having law enforcement representatives from the different countries step up and say, here are the problems that we're facing in transferring evidence across borders. And then the Council of Europe taking it step by step to identify what are the problems and then how are we going to go about solving those, and then pulling the right people into the room for the discussions. I think the OECD process has launched the Trusted Government Access Initiative in much the same way, identifying the real problems that are being encountered and then pulling together the right people to start to address those and try to identify principles that could apply globally. So it's really just pulling the right people together under a framework that is constructive and has the credibility to be able to pull the right people together. So another example would be Shinzo Abe in 2019 launched an initiative called Data Free Flow with Trust, and that really got picked up in the G20 context. And now it has continued in a number of different work streams with the G20 and then also the G7. The German Federal Data Protection Commissioner this past September held a roundtable of the G7 data protection authorities. I believe it was held virtually last year, hosted by the UK. But since Germany had the G7 presidency, it was a really constructive dialogue amongst the G7 data protection authorities. So just continuing under these umbrella organizations to pull together the right people and really have a constructive dialogue. It's challenging, but it's being done in a number of different contexts. Go ahead. Sorry.
Amazing. No worries. Thank you, Katherine. Any thoughts from yourself, Rene?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, because that's maybe my lawyer's thinking, but ultimately, for regulatory convergence work, there needs to be a translation of whatever is found into hard law. So we cannot do it all the time with soft law arrangements and this kind of ideas. So in that sense, corporations that do have a sort of legal form and which in the end can find a translation into legal text are those that are probably better suited if you think of it from the result, from the end. So things like, for example, the regulatory forum that is created under CETA, the agreement the European Union has with Canada, or the regulatory dialogue that's initiated in the context of the UK EU trade agreement, TCA. These are the fora in which we can progress, I do believe, given that we do have actors involved that later can translate whatever is found there into legislation. And there comes, of course, the most relevant tension, since there is a democratic issue at stake. Parliaments, of course, want to be informed about whatever there is discussed. They do not want to have be predetermined by any outcomes of fora where private businesses and public regulators are sitting together, but they want to have a say in this. And I mean, the critical reactions that there were in all European Union member states to CETA, to TTIP with the US or other trade agreements that come precisely from that feeling. So in that sense, I do believe it is important that businesses and regulators come together and talk, so in order one can benefit from each other about sharing knowledges. But at the same time, everybody must be convinced of the importance of transparency of these kind of dialogues, because ultimately, if this is then translated into law that affects citizens and consumers, parliaments will have to take up responsibility in order to check what was decided there. And what, in my eyes, all of the existing fora, they could increase their transparency for citizens to be open also not only for business interests, but also citizens NGOs to participate at tables in order to lower fears, founded or not well founded, that are among citizens towards this kind of fora, and by that to decrease existing tensions.
Fantastic, yeah, fully agree. Really interesting insights there. I'm going to come back to something that you touched on earlier, Katherine, which was with regard to the ability to have almost kind of simplicity or principles that allows sort of regulation to then be put into place in kind of various different countries around the world. And so there's a school of thought, if you like, around if regulations are going to be future-proof and scalable, then there's a benefit in them being principles-based rather than rules or sort of heavy standard-based in order for them to be scaled effectively. I'm interested to hear what people's views are on that, either kind of pros and cons, I guess, of that kind of statement.
Yeah, I think that the Council of Europe Second Additional Protocol for the Cybercrime Convention is a really good example of that effort of drafting principles, but then having enough teeth in the principles for it to be enforceable, but also not so much detail that it can't be implemented and adapted in different legal and cultural and historical contexts. Because with the Council of Europe Second Additional Protocol, in particular, you have the larger nations that have really robust law enforcement authorities and capabilities, and also strong data protection authorities and regulators. But you also have a lot of other countries that we would like to bring into the fold and join in with the Second Additional Protocol. And so there may need to be some capacity building with them. And the rules need to be such that they meet the higher standards that we need, but then also can be adapted by other countries that are building their democracy and building their rule of law structures.
Awesome, thank you, Katherine. Monika, Rene, any thoughts from you around the kind of the principles versus rule-based type regulation?
I very much agree that the principles are the ground level, the stepping stone, and I think that some amount of the standards around the principles is needed, because standards usually allow to hopefully achieve a common definition of principles and some other topics around. So I think that helps, and that's why many solutions, for example, many technical solutions are based on the standards. And then what Katherine has said, that when we try to bring into into the fold some other countries which may not have already relied on those principles or may not have already this kind of laws or regulations. I think as simple as that, showing them what is the benefit, trying to show them to convincingly prove to them that there is a benefit in participation in a uniform and common approach to some legal aspects. That's what would allow to make it easier to achieve basically the objectives of such global regulations.
Excellent, thank you, Monika. And Rene, interested to hear your thoughts, especially given how close you are to kind of DMA.
Yeah, exactly. No, yeah, that's also, again, it might be also in a déformation professionnelle that I'm more for the rules than for the principles, but it also depends on the degree of legal integration that you do have. So with the European Union, we have an international organization that is that highly integrated that we can make rules, because rules ultimately mean to make choices that are beneficial for ones and are not for are disadvantages for others. And principles, they basically allow to have a certain room, and the more broader they are formulated, the larger is the room, and therefore more people can find themselves being reflected by the principles, as they basically have their own opinion being reflected by the wording, although these opinions might be then rather divergent and convergent. So in that sense, principles have a purpose to bring together rather divergent jurisdictions and opinions under one umbrella. And by that, they have a certain purpose, meaning streaming the whole movement into a certain direction. But if you ultimately want to have changes on a certain market or on a certain product, you will have to go to kind of a rule-based system, be it by simply having states implementing principles into rules according to their understanding, or to have the level that define the principles to reshape them step by step towards a rule. But the ultimate goal for regulation to work is a rule and not a principle.
Okay, really fascinating. And what are your thoughts? I mean, this is to the whole panel, I suppose, on businesses and organisations who are then having to implement, I guess, rules versus principles-based regulation. Do you have any sort of particular views on, I guess, the challenges experienced from both sides? I guess because that's what a lot of, for example, my clients and other organisations, they kind of end up grappling with, if you like, when the rubber really hits the road and they've got to implement some of these regulations. Open to anybody really from that perspective.
Well, maybe I'll start for a certain amount of time. Actually, for more than 10 years, I was a single person owning business, and that was actually in the United States. And then I actually tried to run a business here in Europe once and returned to Europe. And I would say that I had a good example of comparison how to deal with different regulation rules. And I would say that the biggest challenge that I face in both continents was that I needed to have a good understanding of a legal language, which for me as a non-legal person, as someone who deals with technologies on daily basis, was very difficult. And I think that to help businesses to implement these rules, to help them to basically so they can comply with them to the best of their abilities, it is essential to find some transitional support between the legal regulations and then the actual implementations, which of course there are many consulting companies, there are many businesses that do, but sometimes I have a feeling that they often reach, or they the capabilities for this type of support usually exist in large organizations, and especially for the small businesses. And we have to remember that majority of the economy is being operated by small and medium enterprises. They don't always have these capabilities themselves. So looking for ways to ease their pain when they implement rules and regulations would be a good approach to this problem.
Fascinating, Monika. And I, I have a couple of views myself on that, but I'll just go over to our panelists first. Katherine, Rene, any thoughts on that at all from either of you?
I personally here totally with Monika. It is ultimately indeed an issue of communication. I mean, the lawyers or the regulators and the legislators, they work with the language of law. And business in particular, when we look at regulation of digital markets, they need to have that translated into workable standards or other means in order to implement it properly in their policies. And this translation work is very difficult to be done in both directions, because we as legislators, also as regulators at times, need to understand how the technical side of things works in order to draft a law that works. But once again, these are different kind of fields that nevertheless have to communicate with each other. So therefore, to have a transmission mechanism between those two is, I think, here of utmost importance. And I think Monika made the point that larger corporations and organizations, they have the capacities in-house, but those that we actually need in order to have a broad compliance are the small and medium-sized enterprises, where capacity building is core. Now, we do have a change in that regard in some new EU legislation that always provides also for funding or capacity building of SMEs, but that there is a lot of potential to grow in that regard. I'm totally with Monika on one page.
Amazing. And I think I was going to say that in my experience as well, working with clients across multiple industries, that continues to be a challenge, Monika. I couldn't agree more that there's often a very huge divide between the language of law and the language of business, and where you see the most effective interpretation of that is those organisations, and they are usually larger, who have legal lawyers and a legal function who can act as that person that's taking in, almost ingesting, if you like, the regulation, and working with then perhaps a compliance program in the second line of defence to help establish, or what does that then mean? How do you translate that into a program whereby which you can embed it into the organisation, both through policy, through ways of working, through process, through controls, and that's where you see the most effective kind of relationship or flow, if you like, from regulation and down into the business. But where you try to go directly from regulation into the business, I think, to your point, Monika, that can be a real challenge just from a language perspective. It's quite fascinating. So that leads me on to another question, actually, with that regard, which is, what's the role that RegTech can play in regard to, I guess, complex regulation, be it converged or not? And I don't know whether any of you have any experience in kind of where you've seen that before. It's quite well established in financial services. We see it in some other industries, but interested to think about whether RegTech could help be a solution for the regulation of AI, the internet, and technology. Perhaps if we start with Monika on that one.
I give it a try, though I had to quickly look up what the RegTech is. Sorry about this. Anyway, from what I understand, is basically trying to use the technology to assess the effectiveness of regulatory compliance process. And certainly, there are certain, I would imagine, techniques that can support this process. Once again, trying to implement them, it's probably a matter of having a good interdisciplinary team. Because anytime when you try to translate certain concepts from one domain to another, and here we're talking about things like purely legal language to business understanding, and then very often within the business it has to be also to translate it into a specific business domain. which could be, anything from critical infrastructure to, I don't know, producing, little toys for, for small children. Having the right interdisciplinary team is what would help in this matter.
Agreed. And to both, I guess, Katherine and or Rene, any thoughts or experience, I guess, with, I suppose, that, the use of technology to help not only identify regulation, but track trends and changes to regulation through into kind of ways of working, I guess.
I can add one thing. I was co-chair of a project that was run by the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, on ways for financial institutions to share data with other financial institutions to better detect money laundering and terrorist financing. And we published a report this past July after holding about a dozen different focus groups, looking at a dozen or so different pilots in different countries where you have financial institutions sharing data with other financial institutions alongside and working collaboratively, really, with their data protection authorities and with their financial supervisors. So really getting all the stakeholders together to come up with some solutions to better detect money laundering and terrorist financing. A big piece of that in these different pilots was really the technology. There's currently a prize challenge going on between the US and the UK over privacy enhancing technologies in money laundering and terrorist financing context. So the technology can really be a driver to help support how the regulations are implemented and potentially new standards in the regulation when it's done right and you have all the stakeholders in the room.
That's fascinating, and it makes you wonder whether there is room for that kind of almost like cross-organisation collaboration, because there are organisations that are going to be grappling with very similar challenges. So is there a way that they perhaps get together in some kind of forum to identify better ways to comply better, almost leveraging technology?
Yeah.
Okay, and fascinating. Thank you, Katherine. Anything from yourself, Rene?
Yeah, I mean, when I do see potential when we are looking indeed at the implementation side of things in order to smoothen certain processes. But the other part is to which extent technology can help drafting regulation. And here I do have my doubts. First of all, it's already very complicated to define how you are measuring the efficiency or effectiveness of one rule or a certain standard. And secondly, even if you were to do so in an objective manner, the ultimate result would still have to have a check by those that are legitimized to adopt a certain standard or to change a certain standard. So in that sense, there must be a legitimization chain down to down to the citizen. And in that sense, let's say when we are looking at the side how technologies can help to improve regulations, it can only go up to the idea of suggestions, of proposals to regulators, but there can never be an automatism as we know it from technology. So at some moment of time, the power of technology stops, and good old human regulators have to take over.
Thank you,
If I can maybe add something to what Rene has said. So I very much agree with you that drafting, a legal act or drafting regulations is absolutely a job for humans. But I think, and you already mentioned this, that getting supporting information to draft the law is a place where technology absolutely has a place. I can give, for example, as an example, the existing NIS directive and the NIS directive proposal, NIS directive 2 proposal, in which actually ENISA has a it's very much engaged because it has many responsibilities. And one of the things that ENISA has done after the NIS directive has been implemented in pretty much in all the member states, or at least it was supposed to be implemented in all the member states, there has been, for example, an investment assessment done by ENISA using different technologies and different technical approach to first, for example, to see how this directive has been implemented by individual member states, what kind of investment, financial, human resources, technical resources has been put into implementation of the directive, how effective is the oversight of the critical infrastructure, and then of course was then inputted toward the drafting of the NIS Directive 2 proposal. So I'm, as an individual, just as a person, I would say human oversight in legislation is absolutely essential, and the technology basically is a supporting instrument in this case.
Fantastic, thank you, Monika. And then I think probably one last sort of overarching question, if you like, or thought, and I'd appreciate all your views on it, and then we'll come to sort of closing statements from each of you. I think it's apparent now, and I think the DOJ did a great job setting out kind of their evaluation when they evaluate organisations from a corporate charging perspective in 2020, and the focus on risk and the use of the word risk in that guidance was great, because it was something that I think wasn't really discussed with regard to regulation, and it was really interesting about the proportionality of a response when it comes to an organisation's compliance programme and how they look to comply with regulation. You see also in the DMA and the DSA that the risk features really, really heavily, and I'm just intrigued to have a viewpoint, really, I guess, because this is definitely a shift that we're seeing, and how important is that, the notion of risk from your perspectives and the roles that you have in terms of sort of regulatory development and then the implementation of reg, I guess. Maybe we'll start with you, Rene.
Now, what we currently see is that, indeed, you mentioned it, the term of risk is coming back in many legislative initiatives. In the DMA and DSA, we have included it. We are currently discussing, in a total different field, corporate sustainable due diligence, where the risk-based approach is included. We are discussing about AI liability. There was a new directive now proposed that also tries to include the idea of risk. So in that sense, risk is from a perspective of a legislator, proportionality. Ultimately, you do not want to and you cannot regulate everything and anything. And if you do that, you would also have courts that say, look, guys, this is not proportionate anymore because you go too much into details and you're tackling, let's say, a small bakery around the corner to have huge reporting on due diligence. That's ridiculous. So in that sense, risk is a term that allows us to adopt appropriate legislation. So in that sense, it is an interesting and good tool to work with if it has proper criteria. To simply talk of risk is also not that helpful. You must also say how you determine risk, and how basically basing a legislation on risk is not leading to loopholes of regulation that can then be used by those that always try to escape regulation. So this is let's say, the challenge that comes with risk. On the other side, you have also the need for a safety net. So if a risk-based approach leads to have gaps in your safety net, I'm particularly thinking about product safety regulation, and in that sense, AI comes into play. You need to have tools to also react if your pre-assessment of risks was wrong, and was basically allowing too many to be underneath the radar, and to adjust it to it. So in that sense, proper risk-based legislation also always needs to have a safety net clause, so that whenever you made a wrong risk assessment, you can correct it, because it's the very nature of a risk assessment that you basically do a kind of it has that you have a certain assessment before a danger realizes itself, and then afterwards you need to adjust. And by that, it has always these two functions. Now, risk in order to be proportionate, but the safety net function in order to remedy in case your risk assessment was wrong.
I can add a bit, thank you, Rene, to U.S. risk-based approaches. So the U.S. government is subject to a law that was adopted in 2002, I believe, the E-Government Act, so that every U.S. government agency was required to conduct and develop a privacy risk assessment for every new technology that included data from people from the public, members of the public. So we've been performing those risk assessments all along for many, many years now, and documenting the risk assessment that was conducted, and then documenting the ways that the risks were being mitigated. And in that risk assessment, it's also very holistic. And it's not just data minimization, which of course is critical, data retention, which is also critical, but how the data may be used, how the data may be misused. So it really focuses holistically on risk. And I will say that the risk analysis approach is in a lot of different frameworks across the U.S. government. The NIST, which is the National Institute for Standards and Technology, has adopted a proposed AI risk management framework as an example. And it also focuses holistically on different types of risks. So a company would sort of develop its own risk threshold and then manage the risks that they identify to those thresholds, within those thresholds. And there's a focus for the companies to be able to look holistically at the risks and even get stakeholder input if needed. So I think it's a really good approach, but risk is critical to understand, as well as the measures to be implemented to mitigate those risks.
Excellent, thank you, Katherine. And anything from yourself, Monika?
What I'd like to add is basically that it puzzles me very often that people consider risk-based approach to legislation as something new, because I mean, risk is something that we deal in, every minute of our life, and legislation always have impact assessment, and impact is nothing else but assessing certain risks, and this is from the perspective of both the potential threats but also opportunities, because risk is not only the negative one. So I think it's not a new notion in legislation approach. It's uses a slightly different rate right now because it's a legislative impact assessment, and for each of the domain, assessing the risk, assessing the pros and cons, because we can also say this, what are the pros and cons of a certain, legal regulations, is something that needs to be done and needs to be basically based on a number of different elements that have to be taken into account in a specific context. Risk assessment in IT is different from risk assessment in legislation or risk assessment in life. We cross the street and we decide, do I cross now? Do I wait till the car passes, right? So it's not an easy, and it is essential to understand the domain, to understand what stakeholders, what kind of resources, what kind of assets have to be assessed, but it is done, and I'm hoping it will be on continuing basis done in the future.
Excellent, thank you, Monika. So we're nearly out of time, and in the last 60 seconds, we're going to rattle through, and I'd just like just a very brief closing sentence, if that's all right, from each of you. And we'll start as we started with intros. So Katherine, starting with you.
In terms of the subject of the discussion, this has been very informative. I will say that I am optimistic that we have a lot of different frameworks based on the same commonalities. And I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to continue to try to reach convergence and interoperability amongst the different legal frameworks to make sure that we can meet citizen and customer expectations and provide public safety. Thank you.
Amazing, thank you. Thank you. Rene, over to you.
Certainly. Now, I do believe that convergence is the natural friend of any cross-border trade activities, because ultimately trade is only working if it is going into both directions, and if it's going to both directions, it only works if whatever is traded can be traded under the similar conditions in both jurisdictions. So by that, it's in the very nature of cross-border trade that we do have convergence. Hence, it is a process that must be accompanied by legislators and regulators, so that the public interest, which is not represented by definition by business interests, is still upheld and can be seen back in the final result.
Fantastic. And last but not by no means least, Monika.
I think both Katherine and Rene has already said a lot that I would have said. So I will maybe just add very quickly that despite that many challenges that exist in trying to achieve convergence, we just basically have to keep moving forward and trying to find common language. And despite many obstacles that, especially in the current, very, very difficult times in the world, that we find basically a way to work together and basically achieve uniformity.
Fantastic, thank you. So I'd just like to pass my thanks and the thanks of everybody onto this panel for taking the time to speak today. I personally found it incredibly informative and feel quite optimistic actually when we talk about some amazing examples of where convergence is occurring and can occur in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.